August 1968, the Nui Dat Firebase in Phuoc Thu Province, South Vietnam. Dawn broke over the red clay with the sound of helicopter rotors and diesel generators. But 5 Australian SAS operators moved in perfect silence through the perimeter wire. They carried no identification, no dog tags, nothing that could identify them if captured. Their faces were painted in greens and browns. Their weapons were wrapped in cloth to prevent any metallic sound. The base radio operator logged them as Patrol Sierra 3 Alpha, 5 men inserting into the long high hills for standard 14-day reconnaissance. What no one knew, what no one could know, was that these men were about to disappear so completely that American command would declare them dead, that search and rescue missions would be launched and abandoned, and that when they finally emerged from the jungle 2 weeks later, they would be carrying physical proof of kills that would make even hardened soldiers turn away in disgust. 40 enemy ears, 20 kills per man. A 14-day patrol that became a ghost story. U.S. Central Command called it impossible. May CV Intelligence declared the report fabricated. Even Australian headquarters questioned whether their own men had gone rogue. You think you know what happened in those hills? You're wrong. How does a 5-man patrol vanish so completely that their own side declares them casualties? Why did the evidence they brought back force a complete reassessment of small unit tactics in Vietnam? What makes men disappear into hostile territory and emerge having achieved what entire battalions could not? Stay until the end, because what happened in those 14 days revealed the truth about warfare that no military doctrine had prepared anyone to accept that. Sometimes the most dangerous soldiers are the ones who stop being soldiers altogether and become something the jungle itself would fear. The patrol's mission seemed routine by Australian SAS standards. Insert into the long high hills, an area of dense jungle and limestone karst formations that the Viet Cong had controlled since the French colonial period. Observe enemy movement patterns. Identify base camps and supply routes. Avoid contact unless operationally necessary. Extract after 2 weeks with intelligence that could guide future operations. The mission parameters were standard. What made this patrol different was the terrain. The long high hills were not just enemy-controlled, they were considered by American forces to be impenetrable. Multiple U.S. reconnaissance teams had been inserted into the area over the previous 6 months. None had returned useful intelligence. 2 teams had been extracted under fire after making contact within hours of insertion. 1 6-man LRRP team had been declared missing, presumed killed, after their emergency beacon activated, and then went silent. The hills had a reputation. They swallowed patrols whole. The Australian approach to this terrain diverged completely from American methodology. U.S. doctrine emphasized speed, firepower, and technological advantage. American reconnaissance. Teams moved quickly through hostile territory, relying on radio communications to call in support if compromised, trusting in helicopter extraction and artillery coverage to survive contact with superior enemy forces. The approach worked in open terrain where mobility and firepower could be decisive. In the long high hills where triple canopy jungle reduced, visibility to meters and limestone formations blocked radio signals, American advantages became liabilities. Speed created noise that alerted enemy forces. Radio communications were unreliable at best and completely blocked in valleys. Artillery could not be accurately targeted through the canopy. Helicopter extraction was impossible in most areas. American teams entered the hills equipped for conventional warfare and found themselves fighting on terms where their advantages meant nothing. The Australians prepared differently. They spent 3 days before insertion studying every available map, aerial photograph, and intelligence report about the area. They memorized terrain features, identified probable enemy positions, planned primary and alternate routes for every phase of the patrol. They reduced their equipment loads to absolute essentials. No spare batteries for radios they did not plan to use. No extra rations beyond what was strictly necessary. Nothing that could rattle or reflect light or create odor that might alert enemy sentries. Each man carried approximately 35 pounds of gear compared to the 60-plus pounds typical of American reconnaissance teams. The weight difference translated directly to mobility and endurance. Lighter loads meant the Australians could move faster when necessary and could sustain operations longer without resupply. The preparation was meticulous to the point of obsession. Every piece of equipment was tested. Every possible contingency was discussed. The team members had worked together for 8 months and knew each other's capabilities and limitations intimately. They were not 5 individuals. They were a single organism preparing to enter a hostile environment. The insertion was designed to deceive. The helicopter that carried Patrol Sierra 3 Alpha flew a standard pattern that included multiple false insertions hovering briefly at several locations without actually landing. The actual insertion point was 3 kilometers from any road or known enemy position, in terrain so difficult that enemy forces would not expect infiltration there. The helicopter touched down for 45 seconds. The 5 Australians rolled out. The helicopter lifted immediately, and within 2 minutes, the patrol had disappeared into vegetation so dense that they were invisible from 5 meters away. They did not move immediately. For 30 minutes they remained absolutely still, listening to the jungle, allowing wildlife to resume natural patterns that had been disrupted by the helicopter, ensuring no enemy forces had been near enough to observe the insertion. Only when satisfied that they had achieved surprise did the patrol leader signal movement. The first 48 hours established the pattern that would define the entire patrol. They moved at night, covering perhaps 2 kilometers in 6 hours of movement. Every step was deliberate. The point man would scan the ground ahead for booby traps, disturbed earth, or any sign of enemy activity, then advance 3 steps. Pause to listen. The patrol moved in single file, with spacing that kept each man within sight of the next, but allowed the patrol to pass through vegetation without creating a trail that could be followed. They avoided all established trails, moving instead through terrain that required constant attention and physical effort, but which provided natural concealment. During daylight hours, they established observation positions with overlapping fields of view, watching approaches while remaining completely hidden themselves. They did not cook. They did not smoke. They whispered only when absolutely necessary. For most of each day, they communicated through hand signals or by touch, maintaining a silence so complete that wildlife began to ignore their presence. The long, high hills rewarded this patience with intelligence that previous operations had failed to gather. On day 3, they observed their first enemy movement, 4-man Viet Cong patrol, moving along a trail the Australians had identified from their map study, but which American intelligence had not known about. The patrol leader counted the enemy. Soldiers noted their weapons and equipment and recorded the direction and timing of their movement. He made no attempt to engage. The mission was reconnaissance. Combat was to be avoided unless it served intelligence gathering or survival. The Viet Cong patrol passed within 30 meters of the Australian position without any indication they suspected foreign presence. The observation provided the first piece of a pattern that would emerge over subsequent days. By day 5, the patrol had mapped an entire network of trails, base camps, and enemy positions that American intelligence had not known existed. They had observed dozens of enemy soldiers moving through the hills with a confidence that indicated they believed the area was secure from Allied penetration. The Viet Cong were not maintaining aggressive security. They were not posting sentries at key terrain features. They were operating as though the long, high hills were a safe rear area rather than a combat zone. The assessment was tactically invaluable. It meant that carefully planned ambush could achieve devastating surprise. It also meant that the patrol was operating in an area with potentially hundreds of enemy soldiers, any of whom might stumble across the Australian position through random chance, if not deliberate searching, the decision that transformed the patrol from reconnaissance to direct action was made on day 6. The patrol observed a Viet Cong base camp that intelligence had suspected existed but had never located. The camp was larger than expected, approximately 40 structures built into a valley with good natural concealment and multiple approaches for resupply. The camp appeared to be a logistics hub with stores of weapons, ammunition, and food supplies being moved regularly to smaller positions throughout the hills. The patrol leader faced a choice. He could continue observing, gather detailed intelligence about the camp's layout and strength, and extract and report findings so that a larger force could assault the position. That was the plan. That was doctrine. Or he could recognize that this opportunity might not recur, that the camp's security was lax, and that a small determined force could inflict significant damage before the enemy could organize an effective response. The Australian SAS doctrine gave patrol leaders extraordinary latitude in tactical decision-making. Headquarters provided mission, intent-gathering intelligence on enemy activity in the long high hills, but trusted patrol leaders to determine how that intent could best be achieved. The doctrine assumed that the soldier on the ground, observing the tactical situation directly, was better positioned to make decisions than headquarters receiving second-hand reports. This trust was not given lightly. It was earned through rigorous selection, extensive training, and demonstrated judgment under pressure. The patrol leader, Warrant Officer Michael Henderson, had earned that trust through 3 previous tours in Vietnam and combat experience that stretched back to Borneo. His assessment was that the base camp represented an opportunity that justified deviating from the original reconnaissance mission. But exploitation would require staying in the area longer than planned and accepting significantly higher risk of detection and combat. Henderson made his decision based on calculation that revealed the difference between Australian and American operational philosophy. American doctrine would have required requesting permission from headquarters, explaining the situation, receiving approval to deviate from mission parameters. That process would take hours at minimum and would require radio communication that might be intercepted. By the time approval was received, the tactical situation would likely have changed. Australian doctrine placed the decision authority with the patrol leader. Henderson did not need permission. He needed only to believe that his actions served the mission intent and that the risk was acceptable. He gathered his patrol, explained the situation through hand signals and whispered words, and proposed remaining in the area to conduct a series of ambushes against enemy forces moving to and from the base camp. Every member of the patrol understood the implications. They were extending their time in hostile territory. They were planning to initiate combat that would alert every enemy force in the area. They were accepting that extraction might become impossible if enemy response was overwhelming. Every man agreed. The patrol would transition from observation to direct action. The first ambush was executed on day 7 against a 3-man Viet Cong patrol carrying supplies to an outlying position. The Australians positioned themselves along the trail in a classic L-shaped ambush. When the enemy patrol entered the kill zone, the Australians opened fire with disciplined volleys from suppressed weapons that killed all 3 enemy soldiers in less than 5 seconds. The sound was muffled enough that it did not carry beyond the immediate area. Before enemy reinforcements could investigate, the Australian patrol had stripped the bodies of weapons and documents, taken photographic evidence of the kills, and disappeared back into the jungle. The bodies remained where they fell. The Australians wanted the enemy to find them. Fear is a weapon. Uncertainty corrodes morale. The discovery that patrols were being ambushed in areas the Viet Cong considered secure would force them to increase security measures, divert forces to patrolling, and create an atmosphere of paranoia that would degrade their operational effectiveness. Even if the Australians never struck again, the psychological warfare dimension was calculated. Henderson understood that the patrol's impact could extend far beyond the immediate casualties they inflicted. If enemy forces believed that Australian special operations teams were operating throughout the long high hills, they would be forced to adopt defensive postures that would limit their ability to conduct offensive operations elsewhere. The five-man patrol could create the impression of a much larger threat through careful selection of targets and timing of attacks. Each ambush would be spaced days apart in different locations, targeting different types of enemy units. The pattern would suggest multiple Australian patrols operating independently rather than a single small team. The deception would multiply the psychological impact. The second ambush occurred on day 9. A 6-man Viet Cong patrol was moving along a trail that the Australians had observed being used regularly for resupply operations. The ambush was executed with the same precision as the first overwhelming fire from concealed positions, followed by immediate withdrawal. 6 enemy soldiers killed in seconds. The Australians took photographic evidence and withdrew. But this time, one of the Australians, a trooper named Kevin Walsh, made a decision that would later become the most controversial aspect of the patrol. He took the ears from the dead enemy soldiers. The practice was not sanctioned by Australian military policy. It was not part of mission parameters. But it had precedent in unconventional warfare dating back to colonial conflicts. The rationale was evidentiary photographic evidence could be disputed. Physical proof could not. But the deeper motivation was psychological. Walsh was sending a message that went beyond military protocol. He was announcing that the Australians were not conventional soldiers bound by conventional restraints. They were hunters. And they wanted the enemy to know it. Henderson faced another decision. He could order Walsh to dispose of the ears and maintain strict adherence to laws of war. Or he could recognize that Walsh's action, while disturbing, served a tactical purpose. Physical evidence of kills was more difficult to dispute than casualty estimates. The ears would prove beyond question that the patrol had achieved the kills they claimed. Additionally, if enemy forces discovered that their dead had been mutilated, the psychological impact would be severe. Enemy morale would suffer. Fear would intensify. The cost was moral compromise and potential violation of military justice if the action was officially reported. Henderson made the pragmatic choice. He did not order Walsh to dispose of the evidence. The message was implicit. What happened in the bush stayed in the bush. The patrol would bring back proof of their kills, regardless of how that proof would be received by headquarters. By day 10, the patrol had conducted 4 successful ambushes and accumulated 20 confirmed enemy kills. They had also accumulated physical evidence that would prove impossible to ignore or dismiss. But the operational situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces in the area were now clearly aware that they were being hunted. Viet Cong patrols had increased in size and frequency. Security around the base camp had been significantly enhanced. Radio traffic that the Australians could intercept suggested that enemy commanders were organizing sweeps to locate the Australian patrol. The advantage of surprise was eroding. The risk of detection was increasing exponentially. Standard doctrine would have required the patrol to extract immediately. Henderson decided to continue operations for one more engagement before calling for extraction. The 5th and final ambush was the most audacious. Henderson selected a target that maximized both tactical and psychological impact, a 10-man Viet Cong unit that appeared to be conducting a patrol specifically searching for the Australian team. The enemy was moving in tactical formation with point man, main body, and rear security. They were alert and prepared for contact. Engaging such a force violated every principle of guerrilla warfare that emphasized attacking only when surprise was absolute and the enemy was unprepared. But Henderson calculated that a successful ambush against a prepared enemy patrol would have a disproportionate psychological impact. It would demonstrate that Australian special operations teams could strike even when the enemy was actively searching for them. The message would be that nowhere in the long high hills was safe. The ambush was executed from elevated positions that gave the Australians both visual and ballistic advantage. The initial volley killed 6 enemy soldiers immediately. The remaining 4 attempted to maneuver into covered positions, but the Australians had anticipated their movements and positioned themselves to cover likely routes. Within 30 seconds, all 10 enemy soldiers were dead or dying. The Australians descended to the kill zone, confirmed the casualties, collected photographic evidence and additional physical proof, then executed their extraction plan with the urgency that comes from knowing that time and luck were both exhausted. The extraction was where the patrol's disappearance became complete. They had been scheduled to extract on day 14 from a predetermined landing zone. But Henderson knew that enemy forces would likely have identified possible extraction points and would be observing them. He made the decision to change the extraction location without informing headquarters. The communication breakdown that followed would lead to the most serious consequences of the patrol. When the scheduled extraction helicopter arrived at the designated landing zone on day 14 and received no contact from the patrol, they reported the team as missing. Attempts to raise the patrol on radio failed because the Australians were maintaining radio silence to prevent enemy direction finding. Search and rescue operations were launched, but focused on areas where headquarters believed the patrol should have been rather than where they actually were. For 18 hours, Patrol Sierra 3 Alpha was officially considered missing in action, presumed captured or killed. The patrol was actually 6 kilometers from the designated extraction point, waiting in concealed positions for an alternate extraction that they had coordinated through an intermediary back at base before the mission began. The intermediary arrangement was unofficial and violated standard operating procedures, but it reflected the Australian SAS understanding that flexibility in operations often required working around official channels. When the alternate extraction helicopter arrived at the correct location, the patrol signaled their presence and extracted it without incident. They returned to Nui Dat Firebase to discover that they had been declared missing, that search operations had been launched, and that their return would require extensive debriefing and justification of actions that had deviated significantly from approved mission parameters. The debrief became the second battle of the patrol. Henderson and his team faced skeptical intelligence officers and command staff, who initially did not believe the claimed number of kills. 40 enemy casualties from a 5-man patrol over 14 days exceeded any previous Australian SAS performance, and dramatically exceeded typical American special operations results. The statistics seemed implausible. The photographic evidence showed dead enemy soldiers, but could not definitively prove the number or that all had been killed by this specific patrol. The mission report would have been questioned and possibly dismissed except for the physical evidence that Walsh and other team members had collected when the ears were presented as proof. The reaction was visceral revulsion, followed by grudging acceptance that the evidence was definitive. The kills could not be disputed, but the method of proof created immediate controversy. Senior officers recognized that if the practice became known publicly, it would create a public relations disaster and potentially expose Australian forces to war crimes accusations. The decision was made to classify the patrol report at the highest level and to assure that knowledge of the physical evidence remained restricted to a small circle of intelligence and command personnel. The official record would acknowledge the patrol's success while omitting the controversial details of how that success was proven. The broader military community learned different lessons from the patrol. For American forces, the lesson was humbling. A 5-man Australian patrol had achieved in 2 weeks what entire American battalions had failed to accomplish in months of operations in the long high hills. The disparity in effectiveness could not be attributed to equipment, firepower, or technology. The Australians had used lighter weapons, less sophisticated equipment, and no fire support. Their advantage was tactical better fieldcraft, superior patience, more effective small unit tactics, and command philosophy that empowered patrol leaders to exploit opportunities as they emerged rather than waiting for permission from distant headquarters. Some American special operations units began studying Australian methods and incorporating elements into their own training and operations. But institutional resistance remained strong. Adopting Australian tactics required admitting that American doctrine was flawed, and that admission was professionally and institutionally difficult. For the Australian SAS, the patrol became a legendary example of what could be achieved through preparation, discipline, and audacity. The successful execution of a mission that most had expected would end in disaster proved the validity of their training and tactical philosophy. But the patrol also forced uncomfortable conversations about boundaries between aggressive combat, operations and actions that violated laws of war. The collection of physical evidence from enemy dead was officially condemned while being unofficially understood as having served operational purpose. The contradiction was never fully resolved. Australian SAS would continue to operate according to unwritten rules that sometimes diverged from written policy, with the understanding that what happened in the bush remained in the bush, and that results ultimately mattered more than perfect adherence to peacetime standards. The sound that symbolized the patrol's methodology was silence. Where American, operations were characterized by helicopter noise, radio chatter, and explosive firepower. The Australian patrol had moved through hostile territory for 2 weeks, producing almost no sound. The silence was not merely absence of noise. It was active discipline, constant awareness, and tactical choice that rejected every impulse to make operations easier through communication or movement that might be detected. The silence was a weapon, more effective than any firearm, because it denied the enemy the awareness they needed to counter the Australian presence. The jungle is full of sound insects, animals, wind through vegetation. The Australians added nothing to those natural sounds. They moved like the predators that already inhabited the environment, becoming part of the ecosystem rather than intruders into it. That silence, maintained for 14 days while conducting multiple combat operations, was an achievement that no amount of training could guarantee. It required psychological discipline that went beyond military professionalism into something more primal, the patience of hunters who understand that survival depends on becoming invisible to prey that outnumbers them by orders of magnitude. A transformation in how Allied forces understood small unit operations in hostile territory was gradual but significant. Before the Long High Patrol, conventional wisdom held that small reconnaissance teams could only survive in enemy-controlled areas through speed, stealth, and immediate extraction when compromised. The Australian patrol demonstrated that under the right circumstances, small teams could not only survive but dominate terrain where conventional forces could not effectively operate. The key was complete acceptance that you were operating in enemy territory on enemy terms, and that your only advantages were patience, stealth, and tactical skill. American doctrine in Vietnam was built on the assumption that American advantages in firepower and mobility would prevail. The Australian approach accepted that in certain environments, those advantages were irrelevant and that survival required becoming better at irregular warfare than the irregular forces you were fighting. The lesson was learned by some units and ignored by others, but the Long High Patrol stood as undeniable proof that the lesson was valid. The physical evidence that the patrol brought back was eventually destroyed. Orders were given to dispose of the ears that had caused such controversy. The official reason was that retaining them served no intelligence purpose and created unnecessary legal risk. The unofficial reason was that the evidence was too disturbing to preserve and too politically dangerous to allow it to exist in any archive where it might someday be discovered by investigators or journalists. The destruction of the evidence did not erase what it represented proof that the patrol had achieved what they claimed, and that the methods they employed, while extreme, had been effective. The evidence was gone, but the tactical lessons remained. Future Australian SAS patrols would operate with the confidence that aggressive tactics in hostile territory were viable if executed with sufficient skill and discipline. The patrol members themselves were affected differently by their experience. Henderson received commendation for leadership and tactical achievement, but was quietly counseled about the importance of maintaining communication with headquarters, even when operational security argued against it. His unauthorized change of extraction point had created genuine fear that the patrol had been lost and had triggered resource-intensive search operations. The lesson was that autonomy had limits and that deviation from approved plans created costs even when the deviation was tactically justified. Henderson accepted the criticism while privately believing that the decision had been correct, and that headquarters anxiety about losing control of operations was less important than the patrol's survival and mission success. Walsh, the trooper who had initiated the collection of physical evidence, received no official recognition or punishment. His actions existed in the gray area between battlefield necessity and prohibited conduct. The official position was that it had never happened. Walsh's personal reckoning with what he had done was more complex. He had violated his own peacetime moral code in service of wartime expediency. The rationalization that it served tactical purpose and provided definitive proof of kills did not fully resolve the psychological discomfort of having mutilated dead enemies. Years after the war, Walsh would describe the decision as one he made in the moment, based on calculation that evidence would be needed and that conventional documentation would be insufficient. He expressed no regret for the decision, but acknowledged that it had cost something psychological that could not be recovered. The experience had changed him in ways that went beyond normal combat exposure. He had crossed a line that most soldiers never approached, and crossing it had required accepting that warfare sometimes demanded abandoning civilized standards in pursuit of victory. The other patrol members processed their experience through the lens of having survived something they understood was exceptional. They had disappeared into hostile territory, operated for 2 weeks surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered them drastically, conducted aggressive combat operations that should have resulted in their deaths or capture, and emerged having achieved results that exceeded any reasonable expectation. The psychological impact was contradictory pride in accomplishment, mixed with recognition that they had been extraordinarily lucky, and that similar operations attempted by less prepared or less skilled personnel would likely end in disaster. They did not discuss their experience outside the small circle of special operations personnel who had security clearance to know the details. The patrol became part of their identity, but not part they could share with anyone who had not lived similar experiences. The enemy perspective on the patrol was documented in captured documents and prisoner interrogations that occurred months after the events. Viet Cong forces in the Long High Hills had been severely demoralized by the ambushes. The discovery that their patrols were being destroyed in areas they had considered secure created psychological pressure that far exceeded the actual casualties inflicted. Enemy commanders had been forced to divert significant resources to improving security, conducting counter-reconnaissance operations, and attempting to locate Australian base camps that did not exist. The psychological warfare effect was exactly what Henderson had calculated: small force creating the impression of a larger threat and forcing the enemy to adopt a defensive posture that degraded their operational capability. The mutilation of bodies had a particularly severe impact on enemy morale. Viet Cong cultural practices around treatment of dead made the desecration especially disturbing. The psychological impact was strategically valuable but ethically troubling, using enemy cultural sensitivities as weapons by violating bodies of their dead. The statistical record of the patrol was entered into classified databases that tracked special operations effectiveness. 40 confirmed enemy kills, 0 friendly casualties. Intelligence gathered that led to subsequent operations that killed or captured dozens of additional enemy soldiers. Disruption of enemy logistics and command in an area that had been considered a secure enemy rear area. The metrics were exceptional by any standard, but the statistics could not capture the human dimension, the 14 days of constant stress, the psychological toll of being surrounded by enemies who would torture and kill you if discovered, the moral compromises made in service of mission success, the transformation of 5 men from soldiers conducting reconnaissance into hunters, conducting warfare that existed outside normal military parameters. The patrol's legacy in Australian SAS culture was permanent. The Long High Hills operation became the standard against which future patrols were measured. Training emphasized the lessons: meticulous preparation, patient movement, aggressive exploitation of opportunities, trust in patrol leader judgment, acceptance that operations in hostile territory sometimes required deviating from approved plans and making decisions that headquarters would not authorize if asked. The legacy was complicated by the controversy about physical evidence. Official doctrine condemned the practice, while unofficial culture understood that proof of kills was sometimes necessary in an environment where exaggerated casualty claims were common and skepticism about reported achievements was the default response. The contradiction was managed through deliberate ambiguity. Everyone understood what had happened. No one officially acknowledged it, and future operators were left to make their own judgments about where tactical necessity ended and prohibited. Conduct began. The American military's response to learning about the patrol's methods and results was fragmented. Some special operations units saw the Australian approach as validation that irregular warfare required irregular methods, and that excessive concern about adhering to conventional laws of war was tactical liability in counterinsurgency. Other units saw the Australian methods as morally compromising and strategically counterproductive, because violations of laws of war provided the enemy with propaganda victories that offset tactical achievements. The divide reflected broader tensions in American military culture about how to fight irregular wars against enemies who did not observe Geneva Conventions or other legal frameworks that governed conventional warfare. The question of whether to match enemy methods or maintain legal and moral high ground despite tactical costs was never satisfactorily resolved during the Vietnam War and continues to resurface in subsequent conflicts. The silence that had enabled the patrol's success became a metaphor for the secrecy that surrounded their methods. Just as the patrol had moved through the jungle without making sound, the official records moved through military bureaucracy without creating public knowledge of controversial details. The classification was justified as protecting operational security, but it also protected institutional reputation from scrutiny about whether Australian forces had committed war crimes in pursuit of tactical success. The silence was protective, both for the patrol members who had conducted operations that existed in a moral gray area, and for the command structure that had created an environment where such operations were possible through a combination of mission parameters that encouraged aggressive action and an oversight culture that did not examine too closely how results were achieved. The sound of that silence echoes through military history as a reminder that warfare often requires actions that peacetime society would condemn, and that the soldiers who conduct those actions carry psychological costs that are not captured in after-action reports or casualty statistics. The patrol members who returned from the long high hills were celebrated for their tactical achievement, while being burdened with knowledge that their methods had crossed boundaries that made their success morally complicated. They had achieved something impossible through a combination of skill, courage, and willingness to employ methods that challenged their own sense of acceptable conduct. The achievement was real. The cost was also real, and the silence that protected them from external judgment could not protect them from internal reckoning with what they had done and who they had become in the process of doing it. The 14 days that Patrol Sierra 3 Alpha spent in the long, high hills represented a kind of warfare that military doctrine acknowledges exists, but prefers not to examine too closely. Small unit operations in hostile territory, where survival depends on becoming invisible and where success requires transitioning from reconnaissance to combat without authorization or support. The operations exist in space between conventional military action and something that approaches assassination or murder, depending on perspective and circumstances. The operators who conduct such missions are simultaneously celebrated as elite warriors and viewed with discomfort by institutions that benefit from their effectiveness while preferring not to acknowledge their methods. The contradiction is managed through classification, through selective reporting, through cultural understanding that certain truths remain officially unacknowledged while being privately accepted. The ears that Walsh collected, and that caused such controversy, were a physical manifestation of this contradiction. They were proof of achievement that the military wanted to credit while being evidence of conduct that the military could not officially approve. The evidence was necessary to validate claims that seemed implausible, but once validation was achieved, the evidence became a liability that had to be destroyed to prevent future controversy. The destruction of evidence did not erase what it proved, that the patrol had achieved extraordinary results through methods that existed outside boundaries of conventional military conduct. The proof was gone, but the truth remained preserved in classified files and in memories of men who understood that some achievements require accepting moral ambiguity that peacetime conscience would reject. The epilogue to the long, high patrol is that it worked. The tactical success was undeniable. The intelligence gathered was actionable. The enemy forces in the area were disrupted and demoralized. The psychological impact lasted longer than the patrol itself. Future enemy operations in the long high hills were more cautious, less effective, more resource-intensive, because Viet Cong forces could never be certain that Australian patrols were not observing them. The 5-man patrol created uncertainty that affected enemy behavior across the entire operational area. The strategic effect was disproportionate to the tactical action, and all of it was achieved by men who disappeared into the bush, who stopped being conventional soldiers and became something the jungle itself would fear, and who returned with proof of kills that forced everyone who saw it to confront uncomfortable questions about what warfare actually requires and what costs are acceptable in pursuit of victory. The sound of silence that characterized the patrol's movement through the long high hills was ultimately the sound of questions that military institutions prefer not to answer. Questions about whether effectiveness justifies methods that violate peacetime morality. Questions about where tactical necessity ends and war crimes begin. Questions about what psychological costs we accept from soldiers we ask to operate outside normal boundaries of military conduct. Questions about whether we honor or condemn warriors who achieve impossible results through morally complicated means. The silence is protective. It allows celebration of achievement without examination of methodology, acknowledgement of success without confrontation with the uncomfortable truth about how success was obtained. The silence is also revealing. What institutions choose not to discuss often reveals more about their actual values than what they publicly proclaim. The long high patrol remains wrapped in that protective silence, acknowledged as tactical triumph, while the full truth of methods and costs remains classified, compartmented, and known only to those who lived it and those who must maintain the fiction that warfare can be conducted according to civilized rules, even when victory requires becoming uncivilized. The men who disappeared into those hills for 14 days understand that truth better than anyone. They became the thing that military doctrine cannot quite name: warriors who succeeded by abandoning the constraints that peacetime institutions impose on warfare, and who paid psychological costs for that success that no amount of official recognition could compensate for. They returned from the bush carrying ears as proof that they had killed more enemies than anyone believed possible. The physical evidence was destroyed, but the metaphorical evidence remains that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is willingness to do what civilized society finds repugnant, and that the soldiers who cross that line carry knowledge that separates them forever from those who never had to make that choice. That separation is the price of their effectiveness. That knowledge is their burden. And that truth is what the silence protects, the understanding that warfare often requires becoming the thing we fight against, that victory sometimes demands moral compromise that cannot be fully reconciled, and that the warriors who achieve impossible results often do so by methods that institutions must officially condemn while privately depending on. The long high patrol proved that 5 men could disappear into hostile territory and emerge having achieved what battalions could not. The cost of that proof was accepting that the methods could never be fully disclosed, that the physical evidence had to be destroyed, and that the truth would remain classified, not because it revealed tactical secrets, but because it revealed moral complexity that undermines comfortable narratives about how wars are won and what sacrifices we demand from those who fight them.